But the idea that China was just a dumb economy putting together stuff designed in California or stealing other people's ideas,
it's long gone.
And I think when the historians look back at this period, what they will say is that America was already withdrawing. I agree, of course, an amphibious invasion would be very difficult. I think even with a maximal Taiwanese effort, it would be extremely difficult for the Taiwanese to defeat that. It would be an illusion to imagine that denying China access to the Taiwanese fabs makes a big difference to China's long-term capacity to build this stuff for themselves. I mean, we've seen this in the last 4 years.
大家好，今天要分享的是澳大利亚知名的国防与战略专家休·怀特在今年5月接受采访的节选。休·怀特曾长期担任情报分析师和记者，并曾出任澳大利亚国防部战略与情报副部长，以及澳大利亚战略政策研究所的首任所长，现为澳大利亚国立大学战略与国防研究中心的名誉教授。在澳大利亚亚太战略，尤其是在中国崛起的背景下，澳大利亚应如何调整对美对华关系方面，休·怀特是一位有着深刻的洞察力和很强的公众影响力的资深学者。他的基本思想可以简单归纳为：中国的崛起不可逆转，这会不可避免地致使美国亚太权势相对衰落。澳大利亚应该增加美澳同盟之外的外交自主性，于中美间寻找中间立场，而非单纯向美国靠拢。在这一段访谈中，休·怀特以其标志性的现实主义视角，拆解了全球权力格局、中美战略博弈与台湾问题的核心矛盾。他的观点既延续了对中国崛起不可逆转的长期判断，又针对经济增速、军事优势等争议点给出了极具冲击力的分析，更在与同为现实主义学者的米尔斯海默的分析中，凸显出对战略选择而非历史宿命的重视。透过这场对话，我们得以窥见西太安全秩序重构期的关键变量，也能更清楚地识别当前战略讨论中的认知误区。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
So as people can tell, you think quite a lot about just like hard economic and military power as kind of the key fundamentals that are driving the relationship between different countries. And on that point, I think something that a skeptic might push back on a little bit is that China's, I think, working age population has peaked around now, and it's going to be trending downwards because their fertility has been quite low for some time. And their economic growth was spectacular for a while, but now is kind of a bit more mediocre. It's come back down to earth, and maybe it will slow down further as they approach the technological frontier, and there's fewer easy low-hanging fruit for them to grab. So does that trend of slower like GDP growth in China change the reality here at all, and like give the United States any more hope that maybe in a decade or two they might even be in a possibly stronger position versus China than they are today?
Yeah, look, it's a really important question, and I think it proved to be very important historically, because one of the ways in which the United States leadership, policy elites, have continued to reassure themselves that they can somehow win the contest with China without paying the kinds of costs and risks that I believe they would have to pay, is they keep on expecting China to solve their problem for them by screwing it up. Now, there's no doubt that China will never grow at 10% per annum again the way it did so spectacularly for decades. No country does. I mean, China's following a pretty normal path for a country going through an industrial revolution. And it's worth bearing in mind that's what China's been doing. When we talk about the rise of China, we're talking about China fundamentally doing what Britain did in the late 18th and early 19th century, what America did through the 19th century, what the rest of Europe did through the 19th century, and that is moving people from very low productivity, subsistence farming or handicraft manufacturing, just people working with their hands, into factories with much higher productivity. And that's what's happened in China. It's just the Industrial Revolution. The only difference is that it's happened late, and it's happened on an absolutely unprecedented scale, and it's happened faster. Now, there are several reasons for that. One of the consequences of that is that, like every other country going through its industrial revolution, you grow like the clappers, and then you level off. So China's never going to grow at 10% per annum again. It's never going to grow at 6% per annum again. Probably be unlikely to. But it doesn't have to. Even if China were to flatline today, just stop growing in real terms, it would still be far more powerful relative to the United States than any country has been since America overtook Britain to become the largest economy in the world sometime in the late 19th century, sometime in the late 1880s. And therefore, the costs and risks to America of challenging China, even if its economy stops growing completely, would be far, far higher than people believed they were when they believed that America was just going to be incomparably dominant for as far ahead as we can see. I mean, it is worth bearing in mind that if you measure economy in PPP terms, which is the relevant measure for strategic affairs, purchasing power parity, taking out the influence of exchange rate and pricing variations. So the measure which determines how much stuff you can actually buy, China's economy has been bigger than America's for a decade. And it's not going to fall back that far. Sometimes the peak China idea suggests that China's gone up like that and it's going to fall away like that. No economy has ever done that, actually. What might happen is that it just goes like that. But even if it goes like that,
you're drawing a flat line for people who can't see the video.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
The Chinese problem is not going to disappear because the Chinese economy disappears. The Chinese economy is here to stay. We now live in a world in which the United States no longer has the biggest economy in the world, and that is a reality we in the West find it extraordinarily hard to get our heads around. But that is the really fundamental reality that we're dealing with. And so I think, it's worth bearing in mind, ever since China started the process of economic reform and opening, which has produced this miracle, and it is a miracle, it is the largest, swiftest, most spectacular shift in the distribution of wealth and power between nations, and one might say also the largest increase in material human welfare in human history by miles. Ever since that process began in 1979 with Deng Xiaoping's declarations, we in the West have underestimated what China could achieve. Now, that's not to say that the Chinese won't make all sorts of mistakes. Of course they will. But I think it would be the height of folly to base any strategic policy on the expectation that China will be less strong relative to the United States in future than it is today. And it will be more prudent to expect that it will be more strong relative to the United States than it is today. And that's particularly true because there's one specific aspect of China's rise which we're only now coming to terms with, and that is that China has moved from being a technology taker to being a technology creator much, much faster than anyone expected. And, this is obviously an immensely complex issue, but the idea that China was just a dumb economy putting together stuff designed in California or stealing other people's ideas.
It's long gone.
Anyone who still thinks that has not been paying attention. One of the remarkable things China has done has expanded tertiary education faster and earlier in its industrial revolution process than any other country has done before. And so I think, the short answer to your question is no. China is here to stay as an exceptionally powerful country. We're going to live in a world in which China is the most powerful country. We may well live in a world in which China is the most sophisticated country technologically. On present trends, the way in which research spending is trending in the United States and in other countries in the West compared to the way it's trending in China, the Chinese will dominate key technologies in the future. And so we're going to have to learn to live with that.
Two other small things to add to that is that it is possible that the US will continue to rival China economically, say if its economy does particularly well for whatever reason, or it allows in a lot of immigrants to boost its population. But it's unlikely to pull away such that it's substantially more powerful. And China, because it has a larger manufacturing share in its economy, that puts it in a very good position, I think, for just like manufacturing the kinds of inputs that you need for hard military power. And furthermore, you're only saying that China is going to try to become a regional power. So it has a much easier task of just defending its local neighborhood in order to accomplish its goals, on your telling, whereas the US is trying to accomplish this much more difficult task of encroaching and maintaining its dominant position near China, which stacks the deck against that effort.
Yeah, that is a really important point. I mean, both points are really important. I'm not enough of an economist to do more than venture this as an observation, but to the extent that China's GDP is made up of people making things, whereas America's GDP is made up of people doing financial deals or designing social media, I do think it gives China an advantage. In the end, strategic rivalry and particularly warfare is a very physical thing. And I think China has a big advantages there. But the second point you make is something that I think is extremely important. And that is that the strategic competition between the US and China is profoundly asymmetrical, because the United States at least pretends to itself that it's trying to preserve a global military predominance. All China's trying to do is to stop America achieving that predominance in its own backyard. And so it has the advantages of location, that is, it's operating from home bases rather than having to project power a long way. It's got the advantage of focus, all its efforts focused right close to home, whereas America's operating globally. And he's also got a very big operational advantage, just as a result of the trends in military technology stretching back many decades. It's a lot easier to, I'll put it the other way, it's a lot harder to project power by sea and air than it is to stop someone projecting power by sea and air. So the fact that America has to send forces into the Western Pacific and China just has to stop them doing that gives China a huge advantage. The balance between offense and defensive in maritime warfare overwhelmingly favours the defensive, which is China's position in a US-China conflict. And lastly, of course, it just cares more. It has the advantage, the balance of resolve favours China in East Asia the way it favours Russia in Ukraine. And so those four asymmetries together, all favouring China, mean that even if America could overcome China's growing advantage in material power, it would still face an overwhelmingly uphill battle, and it has no imperative to do so.
Something that I'm very curious to hear your explanation of is, so I guess you said you're not a capital R realist, but there's definitely a realist flavor to a lot of the analysis that you do.
Yes,
and I think the capital R realist that people might be most familiar with from our current time is John Mearsheimer.
Yep.
And my understanding is that Mearsheimer does believe still, maybe even to like the present day in May 2025, that the US is going to try to repel China and try to remain the dominant power in the Pacific and globally. What's going on? What do you think is the crux of the disagreement between you and him?
Look, I've had a couple of debates with John about this and have a very high regard for him. I might say, I say that because I'm about to disagree with him. Look, right at the heart of John's thinking about this is a kind of, historically rather determinist idea that as a rising power meets an established power, the established power, inevitably tries to preserve their position, and if the rising power and the established power therefore end up going to war with one another, that's the way it's resolved. And I think as far as it goes, that's a pretty good generalisation of what the history tells us. Although Graham Allison of Harvard has pointed out that there are, I think, of the 16 examples he shows, 12 of them ended up that way and 4 of them didn't. And what that tells you is that, nothing in human affairs is inevitable. And whether or not war unfolds depends on the choices that the two countries make. And confronted with a challenge like China's, for example, the United States really has 3 basic choices. It can resist, and then if China keeps pushing, I think a war does become inevitable. Or it can do a deal, meet China halfway, or it can cave in. Now, war is very likely in these circumstances, but it's not inevitable because it's perfectly possible for a country to choose to step back to avoid war. And that's what I believe America is doing. Now, they don't talk that way, at least haven't until Trump. Joe Biden 4 times came out and said that the United States would defend Taiwan. but that's what he says. But nothing America has done gives one any reason to think that they're really serious about doing that. And so I think what we're actually seeing, I think when the historians look back at this period, what they will say is that America was already withdrawing, that US presidents and US secretaries of defense, turn up at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore every year. It's going on right now as we speak, and stand up and tell the assembled multitudes in Singapore that America is committed to remaining a major power in the Western Pacific, but nothing is happening to reinforce that. And I think that's a very, what the historians will say when they look back at this time is that America was already withdrawing because it wasn't taking the steps that were necessary to push back. So I think that where John's analysis is wrong is that he presupposes that America is really serious about preserving its leading position in East Asia, and it transpires that it's not. And if it's not, then war won't happen. Now, I shouldn't say won't happen, because it's always possible that war could break out, so to speak, by mistake. That is that the United States will find itself in a position where it has to make a choice between going to war with China or stepping back. And although all of the logic of the argument that I've been presenting suggests that it should step back, it might nonetheless make the wrong decision. In other words, America has been, over the last decades, has been making what I would see as the right decision from its own point of view. That is, not spending vast sums of money to reinforce a position in East Asia to defend its leadership in this region, which it doesn't need for its own purposes. But that on the night at 3:00 in the morning, when the crisis breaks and the president is faced with a really appalling decision, a president, particularly a Joe Biden, I might say, might make the wrong call and go to war anyway. I think that's a very significant risk. It's also a risk, I think, with Trump, notwithstanding all the things that I've said about him. I don't have very high confidence in Trump's capacity to make the right call at 3:00 in the morning.
All right, let's turn our attention back to the Asia Pacific for a little bit. I guess the distinctive characteristics of the Asia Pacific are that I guess you've got many islands, so it's like somewhat more defensible by nature. The countries are they're less entwined with one another, and they see their security as less entwined with other countries' security.
That's right. Exactly.
And there isn't these existing really strong alliances to build on. I guess so keeping that in mind. The most challenging country situation I can think of out of almost all of these, other than, I guess, Ukraine and I guess possibly Poland, is Taiwan.
Yes.
I mean, Taiwan, it's always had this big question mark about can it rely on the US to come to its assistance? And I think maybe China and the US, neither of them has really known whether that would be the case. It seems like increasingly apparent that over time it's going to become less and less likely that the US really would defend Taiwan. Is there anything really meaningful that Taiwan can do to prevent China from absorbing them, or at least to delay the day that happens, perhaps by spending more money and just raising the costs that would be required for China to successfully invade?
Look, I don't think there is. I think Taiwan is a very difficult case because China is so strong and so determined. And I think, for a country of 24 million to take on a country of 1.3 billion.
It's a heavy lift.
It's a heavy lift. It has the advantage of the Taiwan Strait. It has the advantage of being an island, which does make it inherently more defensible. But to put it another way, if Taiwan wasn't an island, it would never have preserved its position at the end of it was only the fact that it was an island which meant that it didn't fall under the communists in 1949. And if I can put it this way, the Taiwan Strait is not wide enough. And that's always been kind of acknowledged by the Taiwanese. It's one of the reasons why the Taiwanese have spent so little on defence. Because,
I wanted to raise this because I find this just completely baffling and astonishing. But so I don't know whether people know, but I think Taiwan spends something like 1.5% of GDP on defence.
It's more now. It's 2% now, but it's still, considering its position.
Like it could easily be 10%, and I don't think I would bat an eyelid at that level, right? Or maybe more.
Exactly. It's in a 10% predicament. But of course, the fact is, even if it spent 10%, it would give it no reason to expect to be able to prevail.
Okay, yeah, I guess I've heard debate among experts on that. On if they were willing to spend a lot more money, could they adopt a porcupine strategy where they just make it extremely costly to invade? just tons of missiles to attack like any ships that are trying to like an amphibious landing of this type is unprecedented and would be very difficult and challenging for China to pull off. And if you had enough equipment, maybe you could make them nervous enough that they would just always choose to kind of kick the can down the road. That's what some people say.
And it's always a legitimate question. I mean, I think for small powers going up against great powers, what counts as a win is raising the costs and risks to the great power to the point that they don't bother. And that's a perfectly valid thing to do. But I think the problem for Taiwan is that no matter what it does, it can't raise the costs and risks high enough in view of China's imperative. But the other point is, I've never thought that invasion was the most probable Chinese operational option. Taiwan is tailor-made for blockade. It's very easy for the Chinese to prevent any ship or aircraft approaching Taiwan and simply cut it off. Of course, it doesn't cut it off. It simply says ships and aircraft can approach Taiwan from China. And I think it does put China in an overwhelmingly powerful position. And so I agree, of course, an amphibious invasion would be very difficult. I think even with a maximal Taiwanese effort, it would be extremely difficult for the Taiwanese to defeat that. But it would still be a very costly operation because, as you say, I mean, both the sea distances and the scale would be a very big deal. But I don't think that's what the Chinese need to do. So I think Taiwan's position is essentially indefensible. I think the challenge that poses for the rest of us is how honest we are with Taiwan about the chances of us getting support, of us giving them support. There's quite a strong view in the US and for that matter in Australia and in other countries, including countries in Europe, that would be improper to come out and say out loud, now we won't help defend Taiwan, because that might provoke or encourage the Chinese. But the other side to that is that it's very improper for us to encourage the Taiwanese to think that we'll come to their aid if we won't. And I personally think that it's more important to be honest with the Taiwanese so the Taiwanese can manage their relations with China accordingly, rather than to encourage them to think that they'll get support from us when they won't. Now, one thing you'd have to say about Donald Trump is that he's been relatively unambiguous about his lack of support for Taiwan. And I don't imagine the Taiwanese can be under much illusion about that.
Yeah, right. I think something that is unique about Taiwan and might make it vitally important to the United States in a way that Ukraine certainly isn't, is that about 70 to 90% of the best cutting-edge chips that are necessary for training and deploying AI models are manufactured in Taiwan. It's like a remarkable and crazy fact about the world.
Yes.
That this technology that is regarded as potentially, the next nuclear weapons, potentially the next decisive strategic technology, is overwhelmingly made in this tiny island that is like the main flashpoint between the two great powers. It almost feels like a crazy novel. That has tempted some people in the US to say, we actually have to defend Taiwan, if only for that single reason, because Taiwan is providing almost all of these chips to us, and now it's not providing them to China. If this all fell under Chinese control, although the plants would probably be destroyed and wouldn't be operative once China took over. But this does raise the benefits side of the column for the United States in trying to prevent a blockade by China. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I do. I mean, I think the first point to note is it tells you something about Taiwan, that it's achieved this position. And I think one does just have to sort of pause and salute. What a remarkable achievement. But 2 points. The first is the one you touched on, that the smart thing for the United States is not to defend Taiwan, but to make sure that they've destroyed the
fabs, as they're called.
The fabs. Now, that's a very grim and gloomy proposition, but it's a lot easier to destroy the fabs than it would be to defend Taiwan. The second point is that it would be an illusion to imagine that denying China access to the Taiwanese fabs makes a big difference to China's long-term capacity to build this stuff for themselves. I mean, we've seen this in the last 4 years, 8 years nearly now, as America has tried to cut off China's access to US-designed chips. the Chinese have gone around the business, as everyone could have predicted they would, of expanding their own capability. I expect that trend to continue. So I think if you went to war with China to deny them the product of the Taiwanese chip industry, you'd be winning a very temporary victory. And the third point is, of course, that you have to balance the cost to America of denying China those chips temporarily against the costs, the benefits to China of denying China those chips temporarily against the costs of fighting the war. And, I go back to something we've touched on before. This is not a war America can win as a conventional war. It's therefore a war which is almost certain to result either in American defeat or a nuclear exchange. A nuclear exchange in which American cities could be lost. Now, this is where we have to go back to what one might call a Cold War mindset. I just don't think people who talk glibly, I might say, about America going to war with China over Taiwan ask themselves the question, is this worth risking nuclear attack on American cities? Because that is a very real possibility. Now, it's a complicated calculation because, of course, you end up in a terrible game of bluff where, the Chinese try to persuade the Americans that they're going to strike and, it all gets pretty ghastly, but it's a very real risk. And I don't think an American president sitting in the Situation Room at 3:00 in the morning being presented with the arguments pro and con whether America should go to war with China to defend Taiwan in the event that the Chinese try to implement a blockade or an invasion for that matter, would really find themselves saying, oh yes, it's the chips that really matter.
Yeah, it's sufficient, and we can't find some other way or some other workaround to try to manufacture them more domestically or destroy the fabs, as you say.
Exactly, and the workaround is to put a few cruise missiles on the fabs.
Yeah, I think they don't even need to do that. Actually, I think they can do it electronically.
Possibly.
I think it's been set up that way. So
okay.
Yeah, I mean, people have thought ahead.
Yeah, well, that's true.
I would say I think the export controls have been a big hit to China's access to compute for now. And it probably will remain so for the next couple of years. But I think as you look over the 5, 10, 15-year time horizon, the effect probably becomes weaker and weaker as China escalates its capacity to manufacture things domestically. And it's a card you can only play once, because once they have caught up, then they've caught up forever.
And it's worth bearing in mind, 15 years is not very long in this business.
休怀特的这场访谈本质上是对后美国主导时代的战略指南。它的核心观点可归纳为3点：第一，全球权力格局的东升西降已不可逆转，中国的经济规模、技术能力与战略决心决定了它将成为西太地区的核心力量。任何基于中国衰退的战略规划都是徒劳。第二，中美博弈的关键并非谁能击败谁，而是能否找到非战争的共处路径。美国若坚持抵制，将面临极高的战争风险，而让步与妥协并非失败，而是理性的战略选择。第三，台湾问题的风险不在于中国是否会采取行动，而在于外部势力的误判与台湾的幻想。唯有打破认知误区，才能避免危机升级。对世界而言，休怀特的分析提醒大家，权力转移从来不是平滑的过程，但历史宿命论的危险在于，它会忽视人的选择对历史走向的影响。中美作为2个核大国，任何军事对抗都可能引发灾难性后果，而中等国家更需在选边站与战略自主之间找到平衡。对台湾而言，这场访谈则是一记警钟，依赖外部势力，沉迷以武拒统，最终只会将自身拖入深渊。唯有回到9·2共识基础上，通过对话解决分歧，才能实现真正的安全与发展。在这个充满不确定性的时代，休怀特的观点或许不是标准答案，但它提供了一种稀缺的战略理性，即不回避权力转移的现实，不夸大军事对抗的收益，更不忽视和平共处的可能性。这种理性正是当前西太安全秩序重构中最需要的思维底色。